So let me begin by saying that when we talk about the phenomenological tradition in the West, it's a complex tradition. And Husserl represents one strand in that tradition, but only one strand in that tradition. Another strand in that tradition would be the tradition of Heidegger and of Merleau-Ponty. And one way to put this is that when we begin with Husserl's tradition, we begin with the idea of an individual consciousness confronting a world. And the distinction between thetic and prethetic consciousness and a presupposed relationship between subject and object. When we begin with the Heideggerian tradition, we begin with the idea of already being immersed in being and in constructing a world out of that which is ready to hand, and constructing things as present rather than presuming things as present. So one way to understand the difference between Husserl and Heidegger is in terms of what is given and what is constructed. Husserl begins by assuming a given consciousness and a given object, and then asks about the meanings and concerns that we construct. Heidegger begins by assuming a set of concerns and relations and asking what kinds of objects we construct out of those concerns. I think that when we look at the Buddhist tradition, it looks a lot more like a Heideggerian phenomenology than it does like a Husserlian phenomenology. That is, in the Buddhist tradition, we begin with the assumption that we have beings who come to a world with a set of concerns, purposes, anxieties, affect, and so forth, and not with pre-given subjects and objects. And that what we do when we encounter a world is that we construct ourselves as subjects and construct our objects. And then, as I said today, we mistake that which we've constructed for something that we've discovered. So the tradition that I'm going to talk about within the Buddhist tradition is the Mahayana tradition. And in the Mahayana tradition, the central moral phenomenon, the central characteristic to be cultivated, it's called in Sanskrit karuna. Very often that's translated into English as compassion. I'm not sure how it's translated into Italian normally. But I think that compassion is a terrible translation, because compassion comes from passio, and so it comes from something to experience or to suffer, to experience together. Same as empathy, right? It's a pathos. But karuna comes from the same root as karma, which means to do or to act. So karuna is active, and I prefer to translate it as care. So we could say that the fundamental Mahayana moral concern is with learning to care. Now, in this kind of context, it's important to do so without objectifying self or other. And that's very, very important, because to the extent that I treat my relationship as a relationship between I and others, then I create a world that is already dualistically constructed. It's a world at which I place myself as subject at the center and then ask about others in relationship to me. So it's one thing if I say, oh, you're my friend, or you're like me, so I should care about you. That already presupposes a kind of egoism and my understanding of you in relationship to me. And from a Buddhist point of view, that's a reflection of fundamental delusion. That's the delusion that I am at the center of the universe and that everything else is in relation to me, that if I care about myself, maybe I should care about you too, or maybe not, right? Instead, when we think in terms of karuna, the fundamental object of karuna is suffering. And so from a Buddhist perspective, it's taken for granted that suffering, experiencing pain or discomfort, experiencing anxiety, is bad per se. It doesn't matter, it's not bad because it's mine. It's not bad in you because you're like me. It's just that it's bad. And one way to see that is that if it weren't bad, then even if it were mine, I would have no reason to get rid of it, right? So there's the insight that suffering per se is a bad thing. And that doesn't require personalizing. And so the phenomenon of care is a concern for suffering per se. So that if I recognize suffering here, then I should get rid of it. If I recognize suffering here, I should get rid of it. If I recognize suffering there, I should get rid of it. So the phenomenon of care is a commitment to eliminate suffering, not a personalized commitment through attachment to me or to somebody else in relation to me. Yeah, I think so. I think that often when we're confronted with an illusion and we see that we've been taken in by an illusion, there's a kind of cognitive shock and disorientation, because then we no longer know what to trust. And one way to think about that is that our trust in our own perceptual faculties is based upon our conviction that they're generating successful interaction with the world. And when we suddenly discover that our perceptual faculties have been deceiving us, then we no longer really know whether we're coupled to the world or not. And I think the same thing is true, it's certainly true when we wake from a dream, but it can also be true even when you do something like if you wear sunglasses all the time, right? And then you suddenly take them off and you realize that, my God, it's much brighter than I thought. There's a shock and you suddenly don't know whether what you're seeing is correct, or when you see an optical illusion and then it's removed. So I think it's important this way when we try to parse experience and try to understand what we mean. So it's certainly true that in much of our ordinary experience, in much of our reflective experience in particular, we take subject-object duality for granted. That is, we think of ourselves as subjects confronting a world. But it's important to see that that is a particular kind of reflective experience that we valorize. There's a great deal of our experience that is pre-reflective, in which subject-object duality does not structure our experience. So for instance, imagine the nature of your experience when you are playing a sport and completely immersed, or when you're playing a musical instrument and completely immersed, or when you're dancing and completely immersed, or completely immersed in listening to music. In those cases, you don't thematize your experience as me, the experiencer, and it, the experienced. That requires construction. Now, we do that construction a lot. Like right now, we are probably each consciously and reflectively aware of each other. And we think that that's normal experience and that we're simply encountering that. The Buddhist insight that I think is very valuable, it's also an insight that we see in certain thinkers in the Western tradition, I think especially in Heidegger, is that is something we construct, not something we discover. It's a particular moment that emerges out of something more primordial that we then take to be the primordial structure of experience. And I compare that to a cognitive illusion. So, when we imagine the Mueller-Lyer illusion, we think that what we're seeing are two unequal lines. We know that we're seeing two equal lines. Even though we know it, we take ourselves to be seeing two unequal lines. Similarly, right now, we take ourselves to be experiencing a dualistically constructed world, but we know that we're not. Knowing that we're not doesn't enable us to break the illusion, because it's an illusion that we create by reflex. But it's important to see that we don't always create it. We create it in certain specific moments when we thematize ourselves against others. My suspicion is that pretense is an innate drive in ordinary developing human beings. It is absolutely universal across cultures. It would be very surprising if it weren't innately determined, though I don't have any specific evidence that it is beyond its universality and beyond the fact that it's not only universal, but it universally comes in at the same developmental stages. So it really seems to be something that's wired into us. Pretense and simulation are slightly different phenomena, of course, but I think that pretense is the arena in which we develop the skills that we later use to simulate. I think that we learn to pretend because we learn to, in pretense, we learn point of view shift. We learn the distinction between, we learn how to bracket constructions of reality. We learn how to embed reality, unreality inside reality. We learn to handle complementation grammatically. And we learn to talk about the non-existent, you know? All of those things that are so important in theory of mind, in social life, in simulation, in point of view shift, that make us what we are as human beings. I'm dubious about that. I think that with very high functioning autistic individuals, people kind of to the Asperger's end of the spectrum, then there are many ways, including virtual reality techniques, but also including others, to train social skills. But when we train those social skills, we're training a kind of laborious, inferential set of skills, not the kind of spontaneous social interaction that ordinarily developing human beings do. Yes. I think that the disabilities in autism run too deep to be remedied in more than a prosthetic way. I think we're offering a prosthesis when we do those things, which is better than nothing, but it's not a cure, it's a prosthesis.